Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to Ville. On the Ville this week, there is plenty to talk about, so I'm just going to jump right into it, from bowl games to plenty of basketball action, including another win for the ladies last night over Duke. But the first thing I'm going to do is kind of start with football, since the season has now wrapped up. Going to look back on not just the TaxSlayer Bowl, but the season in general, as we kind of wrap up the 2017 football season that, it's fair to say, I don't think there's a fan out there that would label it anything less than disappointing. When you talk about finishing 8-5 going into the season, I think if anybody told you that, you would ask when Lamar Jackson got injured, because that's about the only way I think any of us could have foreseen an 8-5 record. But nonetheless, despite the fact that he did not get injured, and not only that, he returned to New York in the Heisman Trophy ceremony, they still finish 8-5. So very, very disappointing. But I'm going to start with the TaxSlayer Bowl. And the Cardinals losing a game that I think most people, obviously they were a heavy favorite, despite the fact that as they led up to the game, Jair Alexander, James Hearns both decided they weren't going to play. But still, you felt like, considering Mississippi State was dealing with coaching defections, interim staff across the board practically, that Louisville would have enough on their side, particularly offensively, to get the job done, and they simply were not able to do it. And I think that's the biggest disappointment. And when the game started, I think everybody's worst fear came to light. Mississippi State was able to march up and down the field, get 2 touchdowns, and right then I think everybody had almost decided, okay, then the fact that Jair Alexander wasn't playing and James Hearns weren't playing, that's a huge factor with his defense. They reverted back early in the TaxSlayer Bowl to that defense we saw earlier in the season that had Peter Sirmon already on the hot seat when they were giving up tons of points to Wake Forest, Boston College, and teams like that. Came right out of the gate. Mississippi State did the same thing, and that's when everybody started to react, including myself. I said, all right, Peter Sirmon's going to have some explaining to do, because he said that it wasn't just the injuries, guys getting healthy. It was the fact that they were able to figure things out on the bye week, and early on, it did not look that way. However, that changed. By the midway point of that game, the defense had kind of found themselves. They were able to stop Mississippi State multiple times, and the Louisville offense just simply could not consistently move the football and put points on the board. The biggest play to me of that game happened late in the first half. Louisville had managed to score some, but they still trailed. I believe it was 17-14. Had the ball, chance to go in and take the lead. An interception was thrown by Lamar Jackson. Gave the ball to Mississippi State deep in Louisville's territory. They're driving. A minute to go in the first half. It looks like they're going to punch it in. And Trumaine Washington has a great strip, strips the ball, creates a fumble, and then recovers it on the sideline. Just a minute to go, they drive down the field and score to take the lead at the half, 21-17. And at that point, I myself felt pretty good that they were going to come out in the second half, keep the momentum going, and be able to take care of things. But then looking at that third quarter, a lot like the one we saw against Boston College, the Louisville offense simply could not get anything manufactured, despite the fact that they had short fields. The defense came out and got a stop, and then even though Louisville couldn't move the ball, they punted, and then Mississippi State muffs the punt, gives the ball to Louisville on a very short field, and not only do they not score a touchdown, they don't even get a field goal. They miss the field goal. Louisville gets the ball back off another turnover, another short field, and all they get is a field goal. So that third quarter, multiple short field opportunities, and just to put 3 points on the board while the defense was getting stops. Now, I said the third quarter was a lot like the Boston College game. Well, the difference was the defense was getting stops in the TaxSlayer Bowl. Against Boston College, they didn't get any stops. So, again, this is where you go back to saying the defense, even though the start was shaky, they did the job for the bulk of that game and gave the offense opportunities and saved the offense from mistakes that they made. Like I mentioned, Trumaine Washington's the fumble he forced and recovered and gave the ball back to the offense that allowed them to take the lead at the half. Plays like that kept them in the game. If Mississippi State punches that in, they take a 10-point lead at the half. But that third quarter, really, that was what doomed this game. Only putting up 3 points and having a lot of short fields and pretty much allowing Mississippi State to do nothing. That kept them in the game. And then in the fourth quarter, we saw what happened. Louisville's offense still struggled to move the ball, and Mississippi State was able to do just enough and they took the lead late there. Now, the only disappointing thing I'm going to say about the defense in the second half was the play they gave up on 3rd and long on that go-ahead drive for Mississippi State with Louisville up 3. They had a 3rd, and I think it was a 3rd and 11 from about the 12-yard line. And at that point, I'm not a football guru, but it was pretty obvious that Mississippi State was not going to do anything that they felt might risk a turnover. They were going to play it safe, take the tie with a chip shot field goal, worst-case scenario. So they're probably just going to run a quarterback draw or some kind of read option, something very safe. So keep them in front of you. Don't let them get a touchdown or even a first down. And the defense gave up what appeared to be a touchdown at first, but it was overruled. But nonetheless, it was a first down, allowed them to score on the next play. And that was the only disappointing play. At that point, you would have thought that they would have played them up front very safe, keep them in front of you, maybe bring some pressure and force them to make a quick throw or a quick reaction. And they basically just played soft, way off, and allowed them to get down and get the first down. So that's the only big criticism of the defense I'm going to have. But Louisville still had the ball back with plenty of time to go down and take the lead if they could have scored a touchdown. And Lamar Jackson threw another interception on it. Was a bad throw. He had four interceptions, which, it's disheartening to see that he had likely his worst game of his career. Definitely his worst in terms of interceptions, throwing 4 of them. Now, one was not his fault. The throw to Jalen Smith that was missed was not really Lamar's fault. It was a little high, but it certainly wasn't egregiously high, especially when you looked at the replay from the line. He kind of had to throw it where he threw it, or else it would have been hit by a defensive lineman. That ball was very catchable and should have been reeled in by Jalen Smith, so I'm not going to put that on Lamar. But that late one that he threw definitely was. It was a late throw behind the receiver, and Mississippi State was just able to get the pick. And at that point, it looked over, but the defense got another stop and gave the ball back to Louisville. But at that point, they were out of timeouts, and the clock was ticking. They just couldn't get the job done. The pressure was too much for Lamar. And he reverted back to doing those things that he did as a freshman, then early in his sophomore season at times, trying to do too much. Instead of just throwing the ball away, saving 10 or 12 yards, 15 yards, he tried to scramble and make a play, and he just was not able to, and took, I think, consecutive sacks on that last possession that just pretty much doomed him and forced him to just kind of throw a Hail Mary to end the game. But 31-27 loss. Certainly, if anybody was kind of excited, if Louisville could drive down and score a touchdown and take a lead 34-31, I predicted a 35-31 win, so that would have been ideal for me. But unfortunately, that did not happen. And looking back, obviously very disappointing. We've covered that. But when you look at the coaching staff, and instead going into this game, Peter Sirmon, a lot was going to be on the line for him when you talk about the guys not playing. Okay, what's the defense going to look like? And early on, it did not look good. But the way they were able to kind of shore things up and prevent, basically kept Louisville in the game. I mean, that's the only way you can really say it when you're able to talk about the turnovers they forced, the stops they got. The offense just simply did not do their part in this game. Had they done so, it would have been a fairly comfortable victory. I mean, instead of kicking just one field goal on 2 short fields, if they get a touchdown to field goal, if they're able to move the ball a little bit more efficiently in the first half, and the offense just could not keep the ball moving consistently. Now, some of that has to do with the fact that despite the fact Mississippi State was reeling with coaching turnover, interim staff, their first-string quarterback was out, the defensive side of the ball was not an issue for Mississippi State. They were still one of the best defensive teams Louisville was going to face all season, probably second just behind Clemson. They were able to get to Lamar Jackson. And what I see here is Petrino losing equity. In talking about the play calling, Peter Sirmon, I think, bought some equity. I think, a lot of people were wanting him gone. In terms of his contract, it's probably, even if they performed horribly in this game, getting rid of Peter Sirmon probably is not an option. So that's just not going to happen. But, when you look at how they performed in this game, I think he's going to, you have to give him more time. Now, I think the circumstances in this game helped. When you talk about Mississippi State's offense, Dan Mullen gone, coordinator's gone, first-string quarterback not there. I think they benefited from that, just like they benefited earlier in the season from the weather against Syracuse and not having their first-string quarterback either. But nonetheless, they performed well enough to buy more time for Peter Sirmon. Now, Bobby Petrino, my criticism of him at this point was, in a game like this, Lamar Jackson struggles when he gets anxious. And I think he gets anxious under two circumstances. He wants to do too much. He wants to have a great showing. We saw that against Clemson earlier in the season. And when he feels pressure, that also kind of makes him anxious too. And Mississippi State, as did Clemson earlier in the year, brought a lot of pressure. And I think early on in this game, he was kind of having to move around quite a bit, extend plays with his feet. And when Bobby Petrino calls play after play with him in the pocket, and the pressure comes and starts to get to him, I think that gets in his head and he starts counting, and then you see his form break down, and you saw a lot of high throws. He starts thinking about it, and he loses his mechanics, and that's when the throws start floating on him or just not as accurate. So to me, it was very disappointing to not see a little bit more from Bobby Petrino in terms of the plays to allow Lamar Jackson to maybe move the pocket around a little bit, run some play action out of the read zone, read option stuff. They never do that, ever. I saw some things on Twitter from people that know a lot more about football than I do, questioning why does Louisville only run play action out of a under center deep handoff? They never run it out of the zone read. And I've been asking the same question for 2 years. I see teams all over the country, all divisions, all levels, run that all the time. And it can be so effective when you talk about running quick strikes to the tight end. You run the zone read, play action, and boom, the tight end's just streaking, you hit him down the middle. But you just never, I think I've seen 2 plays that I can recall the past 2 seasons running that. And little things like that, changing it up, quick hit stuff that kind of, to counteract that pressure that the defense is bringing at you. And if you don't do enough of that, then, you saw what happened with Lamar Jackson, and I think it just really hurt him. So it's sad to think that Lamar Jackson now hurt himself playing in that bowl game, and you can't disagree with that whatsoever. And there's now some speculation, is Lamar Jackson, is he going to return? I highly doubt that still. Now, there was some buzz on Twitter this week regarding, the likelihood that he could return. And this from Charlie Campbell of, Draft Campbell. This is one of these internet experts. Said per sources, NFL teams hearing Lamar Jackson and Sam Darnold from USC are inclined to go back to school. They're weighing that business decision. Now, the irony in this is, I think this came out on Wednesday afternoon, and people got excited, started talking about it. But within like 3 hours of this thing coming out, Sam Darnold declared that he was going into the NFL. So you can't really weigh the things that these people put out with. You got to take them with a grain of salt, because frankly, a lot of times this is just speculation, hearsay. They're going to put that out there to get some attention, and oftentimes it's not quite accurate. But nonetheless, this was enough to generate enough interest from Louisville fans and others to say, hey, is Lamar going to return? What has he been talking about in the days after the bowl game? And certainly, it's not out beyond the realm of likelihood he could return. I just think that at this point, what is he going to prove by returning? I just don't think there's a lot to gain. Now, I guess one of the biggest things that he can do is graduate and get his degree. But and of course, if it's important to him and his family and they want him to do that, then by all means, do that. But, of course, the risk of injury, the risk of gaining nothing, dropping. Okay, he may not even be a first-rounder right now, but if he comes back and struggles, let's say he has another season very similar to this. Oh, and by the way, they start with Alabama. Then, you look back, and again, if he gets his degree, that's great. And if maybe that's the number one thing he wants to do right now, and if his family doesn't need him to go and get money, that's fine. But I'm gonna support Lamar Jackson, whatever decision he makes moving forward, but he doesn't have a lot of time to make that decision. I think January 13th, so you're talking about just over a week before he has to make a decision on if he's going to enter the draft. So we're going to know very soon if Lamar Jackson will be back next year for Louisville, and I'm thinking in all likelihood he will not be, but we shall see. It's kind of scary to think if he's not back, it's going to be Juwan Pass in his first start. That's another disappointing aspect of this bowl game. If Louisville could have just gotten out to a 2 or 3 touchdown lead, put some pad between them and Mississippi State, you may have been able to put Juwan Pass in there against a very good defensive line, against that pressure, and give him a little taste of an SEC defense before throwing him to the Wolves against Alabama to start his career as Louisville's quarterback. So that's certainly going to be one of the biggest challenges any quarterback wearing a Louisville uniform has seen in quite some time if Juwan Pass is the starter. come this fall against the Alabama Crimson Tide there in Orlando as they kick off the 2018 season. But long way to go until then, and the first step in learning how next season is going to go is learning if Lamar Jackson will be back or not, and we'll know that here very soon. One other note, Jerron Christian, a great junior offensive lineman for Louisville, announced this week he will enter the NFL draft, so his career is done. There's also speculation that some other guys on the line could do the same. McNeil, I believe. So now you look at, okay, the likelihood of Lamar returning now, probably even less when he looks at his line, because that was looked at to be one of the strengths next year. All those guys coming back, very young offensive line this year that improved. They struggled in the bowl game, but again, that was a very good defense that Mississippi State had, but they certainly performed much better last year. And with Summers now in the fold, I think most people are confident that the offensive line is going to continue to progress. But if guys are going to be leaving and new guys are going to have to step in, they have good depth there now, but whenever you lose a guy like Christian, who's been there since a freshman, he's been a starter and one of the blocks on the offensive line that you begin to rely on as a guy who's going to perform week in and week out, and he certainly did that. And best to him, we can't wish him anything more than the best. Certainly he will do, I think, pretty well there in the NFL along the offensive line. Also, a shout-out to, speaking of offensive linemen, the Buffalo Bills were able to make it to the Super Bowl. So the Cardinals have some, I think, 4 players in Buffalo. Preston Brown, who led the league in tackles, which is awesome, led the NFL in tackles. And, of course, Eric Wood, the offensive lineman center there for the Buffalo Bills. Going to play in their first playoffs. The Bills hadn't been there since, I think, 1998 or 99, if I remember correctly. So congratulations to those guys, too. I want to get that out. One other note regarding Twitter, I put out a poll, and I couldn't help it. And as I say, it wasn't fair. But looking back on their careers, if you had to choose a quarterback, if you had a game next week and you had to name your starter and you could pick between Teddy Bridgewater's career at Louisville, basically the quarterback he was when he finished at Louisville, and Lamar Jackson, the quarterback he was when he finished at Louisville, who would you pick? And like I said, it's not fair. It's like asking somebody to pick their favorite kid. It's just not a fair question. But nonetheless, I did, because mainly it's such an interesting dynamic when you talk about the differences between the two. They're both outstanding quarterbacks in their own way. They're just so different, what they bring to the table. Lamar's sheer athleticism, the things he can do with his feet and his arm. But then you have Teddy Bridgewater, who is such a student of the game and just manages the offense so well and is able to just seemingly get things done and make the play that needs to be made. And of course, I'm no huge Twitter celebrity, so I didn't have a whole lot of votes, but I had about 90 votes on the poll, and really the percentages came out to about 60-40, finished at 58-42. Doesn't surprise me. I went on the line. I said that, I would have taken Teddy just because I felt like his ability to not make mistakes, to manage games and make the plays that need to be made, just he had shown an ability to do that just at a little bit higher level than Lamar. Now, he comes nowhere close to Lamar in terms of the big play he can break at any moment, but I just feel like if you had to have one guy and you feel like he could make sure that plays were made and mistakes were not made, that's the reason I would go with Teddy. But you really can't lose either way because they're both outstanding. But from the time this poll started, the percentages were about 60-40. I mean, right out of the gate, the first 10 votes, I think it was 6-4, and it pretty much stayed there the whole time. So even though this isn't a huge turnout in terms of how many people voted, I think it's a pretty good sample to give you an idea, and I thought that was interesting. But again, it's a win-win. You don't lose either way. But Teddy came out there 58-42. So wrapping up the football season, again, if somebody had come up to you before the season kicked off and said, well, they're going to lose 5 games, including the bowl game, and Lamar Jackson is going to be in New York, then you'd really be scratching your head and thinking, how in the world can that happen? Can he put up numbers? Oh, and they beat Florida State. That's really, you'd be scratching your head saying, well, how in the world did he miss a bulk of the season and somehow have a huge finish to get to New York or what? But really no way other to say it than a little bit disappointing. The next big date for football, other than Lamar Jackson's announcement if he's going to stay or not, is the signing day that will lose some of its luster because we already had the early signing day, but the official national signing day is coming up the first week of February. So that's the next big day there. And, of course, Louisville will probably sign a few more guys, but they signed so many in the early signing day, not nearly as much hyper excitement around National Signing Day. Moving on now to basketball. And, again, last weekend was no fun for most Louisville fans as Louisville went into Rupp Arena and simply were not able to get things done and were crushed by the Wildcats in a game that really, to me, the most disappointing part of it was they just seemed to, I don't want to say quit, but get very disheartened and let the environment of the game, the way in which it was called early on, get inside their head and just really just did not seem to know what to do once they got behind against the Wildcats. Early on, it looked pretty good. They came out, Kentucky scored the first 5 points, and they answered with an 11-0 run. And at that point, I loved what I was seeing. They were taking good shots. They were getting in transition. And they answered that early 5-0 lead by Kentucky by jumping right back on top. And then they kind of traded blows for the next several minutes. And I felt like things were looking pretty good. Now, what I did notice in the first 10 minutes or so of the game is both teams were doing a good job of getting into the lane, getting to the rim, but fouls were not being called on both ends of the court. Now, a lot of people say, oh, Homer Louisville fan, you're going to blame the officials for Louisville's loss. No, I'm not. What I am going to blame them on is setting a tone that then allowed Louisville to let that bother them and get to them. I think the narrative going into Rupp Arena is always, oh, you're already behind the 8 ball. It's 8-on-5. And let's be honest, in the first 10 minutes, if you saw both teams driving to the basket, one team was getting calls almost every time, the other team was not. They're not calling it the same on both ends. That's all I ever ask for an officiating crew. If you're going to call it one way on one end, call it the same way on the other. Q was getting to the basket. Honest was driving to the basket. Dang Adele. And they weren't calling any fouls on Louisville's end. The first 10 or 12 minutes, Kentucky was repeatedly going to the free throw line. So at that point, I think what happened was not only did a couple guys get fouls and force them to sit, but for Louisville, but they started thinking, okay, I'm trying to get to the basket, and I keep going in there, and there's contact, and they're not calling a foul, so what am I going to do? Well, I guess I'll just settle for jump shots. That's the wrong thing to do. You can't let that dictate the way you're going to play. You have to keep doing what you were doing because, look, the game was tied. Okay, the game was tied at 21, about 7 minutes to go, and Ray Spalding committed a horrific, this is not on the officials, a slap-down foul in the lane. If Ray Spalding is going to get a foul, it can't be 24 inches off the ground slapping at the ball. It's got to be up high, challenging a shot. And I think it could have been, I honestly think both of his fouls were slap-down fouls in the lane. And if you're Ray Spalding, you can't do that because you're crippling your team, especially in a game like that in Rupp Arena. So he sits down. Honest Mahmoud had already sat down with 2 fouls. And at that point, I was watching the game with some people, and I said, the game's decided from here to the end of the half. The last 7 minutes are going to determine this game. And sure enough, Kentucky continued to do what they were doing, to their credit, getting into the lane, getting shots, and Louisville started settling for jump shots. The first shot they saw, they weren't moving the ball. I talked last week, drive, draw, and dish. Move around. You got to stay moving. You got to move the defense, make the defense work. If you don't, you're going to settle for bad shots. You're not going to shoot a good percentage, and that's what they did, and it just snowballed. Next thing you know, Kentucky's up 14 points. Game's certainly not over at that point, but in the second half, you saw nothing change for Louisville. They just continued to rush shots, not move the ball, settle for bad shots. Kentucky continued to work the ball around, get to the basket, and Louisville's defense, I think, also was very lax in the second half. And again, I don't want to say they quit, but there was talk from the other side of Kentucky's locker room that they felt like Louisville just kind of quit and stopped playing. So afterwards, there were some comments by Louisville players regarding the lineup that they had to put in there when Ray Spalding and Honest Mahmoud were out, that they really hadn't done that before, and it was kind of crazy. They didn't know what was going on. And at that point, you got a little bit of a vibe is that, are they throwing David Padgett under the bus by saying this? I don't think that was the intention, but you kind of got that impression when you hear him say that. And to me, the ownership of what happened in Rupp Arena doesn't fall on David Padgett. It falls on the players who should be leading this team who have been there before. Quentin Snyder, Dang Adele, Ray Spalding, Honest Mahmoud. They've been through these battles with teams in hostile environments. they've got to play smarter. They've got to do things that aren't going to get their teammates in a position where they're playing in a lineup that they haven't practiced with before. So Anas Mahmoud has to be smarter. Ray Spalding can't get slapped down fouls. And I think when you look at the makeup of this team and the makeup of the coaching staff being so new, David Padgett isn't a fiery guy, especially considering what the guy Rick Pitino's personality and the way he did things. None of the leaders on this team are fiery guys. So I think what happened was you just had an environment in which none of them really took ownership and took control and really, said, hey, we're not going to let this happen. So hopefully that game, as bad as it was, showed them that they can't let that happen again. And next time they start to see that happening, somebody can step up, take things by the reins, and say, look, we've been through this before and it's not going to happen again. We're not going to sit here and let a team run us over because we're not doing the things we need to do to be successful. So, that's what I'm hoping comes out of the Kentucky game. Because if you can't learn from that, then you're probably not going to learn from much of anything. So hopefully they do that. I just said do. And move forward. And since then they have already moved forward. And if you're going to get hammered by your arch rival in blowout fashion, the best thing you can do is have a home opener against one of the most abysmal teams in the Atlantic Coast Conference, the Pittsburgh Panthers. Kevin Stallings and his road show came in on Tuesday night to the Yum Center in Louisville. Much better look in terms of their energy, their urgency. Now, again, grain of salt because you're playing the Panthers, who are just flat terrible these days, probably going to finish last in the ACC, probably struggle to win 2 or 3 games in the ACC. But I think if we saw Louisville come out and struggle against Pittsburgh, then you could throw up the flare that there's a serious problem. But they didn't. Not only did they take control of this game, a little bit of a shaky start. Once again, that's kind of the modus operandi for this team. The first 5 minutes, they just seemed to have to get warmed up. It took them, again, a little bit of time, but then once they did, I think they trailed 7-2, but then went on a run to take the lead, never relinquished it, pushed it out to double digits, and then it pretty much stayed there the rest of the game. Pittsburgh, they were up 18 at the half. Louisville was. Pittsburgh made a little bit of a run at the start of the second half. I think it was a 7-0 run. But then Louisville was able to push it right back out and pretty much keep it in that 20 to 15 range most of the game. And then really at the end of the game, they pushed it out even further. So that was good to see. They didn't let a team that they had no business hang around, and they took care of it. 11th straight win over Pittsburgh, extending to one of the longest winning streaks Louisville has over any other program. And it's crazy to think when you look back at those teams that Jamie Dixon had at Pittsburgh and how good they were, the number 1 seeds, the conference titles in the Big East, that Louisville would now be in a spot where they've won 11 straight and handed them some embarrassing losses. If you remember last year when they went up to Pittsburgh and beat them by 55 points in one of the biggest dominating performances I can recall from a Louisville team. And again, speaking of teams that quit, Pittsburgh certainly in that game quit against Louisville. But something interesting that came from this game, and perhaps it was done to steal attention from what was an awful performance by his team, but Kevin Stallings decided to get into it with a fan or fans, of which I guess he assumed were Louisville, even though apparently they said they were Kentucky fans. But after the game, or during the game, towards the end, they were giving him the business. And he said, well, at least we don't pay our players $100,000. And they said it multiple times. You've obviously heard it by now. I'm not going to go into it a lot. But, first of all, it's totally inappropriate for a coach to say something like that. And second of all, he was saying it about Louisville when the fact has come down that it wasn't even Louisville fans saying it. So I'm not even sure. And then after the game, he said, well, I'm going to defend my players. They were saying crap about my players. Well, everybody who was around was saying that he was getting heckled about him, not his players. So if indeed the fans, I don't care who they were, the Louisville fans, Kentucky fans, Pittsburgh fans, if they were heckling him and not his players, it's pretty weak to come to the press conference and say, oh, they were saying crap about my players, I'm not going to take that, when he knows full and well it wasn't about his players. So I wasn't there, so I can't say for sure, But first of all, if you're a coach at any Division I program, especially a major Division I program, it's just a bad look to get into it with fans and speak directly to them and address them and give them recognition of their comments. Maybe you should focus on the team on the floor, and you wouldn't be getting heckled. So we'll see the fallout from this. Is he going to get fined? Pitino apparently sent a text to John Ramsey saying that Kevin Stallings is a jackass, and you can quote me on that. I don't know if that was appropriate as well, and I don't know if Rick Pitino is the person who needs to be commenting on other coaches, but nonetheless, you can't disagree with that comment based on how Kevin Stallings handled this. But it's not the first time he's been caught saying unusual things, but this one certainly is. You just got to keep stuff like that out of it. If you're a head coach, you can't let it get under your skin. And again, the fact that I don't think they were talking about your players, Kevin. They were talking about you. So don't use your players as an excuse as to why you said what you said to fans. And then you need to understand that they likely weren't even Louisville fans. And if they were Pittsburgh fans, that's I put out on Twitter, it's like some people were saying he did a good thing. Oh, good job, Kevin Stallings. That was good. I'm glad you did that. But what's he going to do when his own fans are heckling him in Pittsburgh at a game? Is he going to go back to the Louisville comments, or maybe he's going to throw in North Carolina? So understand that the issue is you're getting heckled for your performance by your fans, not opponents' fans about your players. So we shall see going forward how Kevin Stallings, what comes of that in the future. But just a bad look. I mean, you just can't say things like that. But the Cardinals got the job done against the Panthers, and they will move forward and open things up on a road opener this weekend against Clemson down in South Carolina. Another interesting thing that came about this week is, and I don't know if it's because of the performance in Rupp Arena that was obviously not good, but a lot of coaching search talk has started to come up. And Kenny Payne, a former Louisville player, and of course, as we all know, one of the top assistants to John Calipari at Kentucky, his name, an article by Rick Bozich at WDRB, quoting a lot of former Louisville players from that 80s era, Milt Wagner and Billy Thompson and Purvis Ellison and others, putting their name behind Kenny Payne as a good candidate for Louisville's next coach. And I have no problem with them giving us or giving input on who they think is going to be or who should be the next coach at Louisville. But don't get me wrong, Kenny Payne is one of my favorite players back in the 80s. I was fortunate enough to be around then. I am that old. And Kenny Payne was one of my favorites because he had such a pure, just perfect form on his shot. Just a beautiful-looking stroke. Great shooter. Freshman on that 86 team that won the championship. So I love Kenny Payne. I was even in New Orleans in 2012 when Louisville and Kentucky played in the Final Four, and I got in an elevator, and Kenny Payne and some of the Kentucky assistants were on the elevator, and on my way out of the elevator, I couldn't resist. I said, we all know who the best coach standing here is, and Kenny Payne I had my Louisville gear on, so they knew I was a Louisville fan, and I wished him luck, and this was after they had beaten Louisville. So I love Kenny Payne. I think he's done a great job. Now, the problem here is if you're the University of Louisville, I just don't feel comfortable giving the reins to somebody who's never been a head coach before. If Kenny Payne had been somewhere and been successful and showed that you can get the job done as a head coach, I would not hesitate to bring him in. This has nothing to do with Kentucky. The only issue I would have in terms of reputation would be having just gone through the issues Louisville has gone through is a little bit unusual for them to bring in a guy from a program who has been thought of, to not do things the right way. Kentucky hasn't been found to have done anything wrong, of course, but the talk has been out there, World Wide West, and so on and so forth. You bring in Kenny Payne, and people can just come right back and say, oh, well, you really want to get things cleaned up. You're bringing in a guy from, a program who is rumored to have done all the same things, but they just haven't been caught. Well, again, they haven't been caught, but you can still understand where that's just a bit of a kind of a mixed message. If you're trying to clean things up and you bring a guy in from a program who has had rumblings and things that have gone on and rumors and such. So I just don't know if that's a great look And then, of course, is the whole Nike Adidas thing. Louisville's still an Adidas school, big contract. I don't think that's going away. You bring in Kenny Payne, is he gonna? He has a strong relationship, and he has for years with Nike. He was in Oregon before he came to Kentucky, and of course, Oregon is Nike USA. So would that cause a problem? So there's all sorts of different variables coming into play when you talk about Kenny Payne and if he's going to be a good coaching candidate. Now, again, for me, it starts with the fact that he's never been a head coach. I think if you're Louisville, you start with head coaches, and you move down from there. And some other names like Billy Donovan have been thrown out there. To me, anybody talking about Billy Donovan as Louisville's next coach simply just doesn't see the whole picture, because anybody from Rick Pitino's coaching tree, now it's one of the best in the business, but you're just not going to get a guy from Pitino's coaching tree. You're just not. With everything that's going on between Pitino and the university, lawsuits in both directions. If you heard Kevin Willard before Seton Hall played at Louisville, he was asked about coming back to Louisville and everything, what it meant to him. And he flat out just said, it doesn't mean anything to me now because Pitino's not here. And that's pretty much, I would think, the attitude you're going to get from a lot of these former Pitino assistants. They really don't have any love for Louisville because Rick's not here anymore. That was the more important aspect of it. It had nothing to do with U of L. It had everything to do with Rick Pitino. So I think it will be a tremendous waste of time. Now, Donovan is a great coach. I just don't think you're going to get any sort of response from him because I think his loyalties are going to lie with Rick Pitino, and he's not going to show any interest in coming to Louisville. So I think, Chris Mack's name is one that's up there. I think that's where you start with a proven coach outside of the Pitino coaching tree. That's where you start, and then you work your way down from there. But I think Chris Mack's name is the one that has been talked about the most because he has that connection. His wife is from Louisville. I think I'd heard her family was even Louisville fans. I don't know if that's true or not. But regardless, I think that connection is what the reason a lot of people, and the fact that he's a great coach. He's done so much up there at Xavier, very limited resources in a smaller conference. Now, the Big East is one of the best basketball conferences, but when you talk about overall, not considered a Power 5 conference. But he has done outstanding. So if I had to put somebody at the top, I don't know if I'd put him at the top, but he's certainly a top 3, and I think that's the one that makes the most sense right now. But that's going to get ramped up. I think right now you still have to give David Padgett time because, as I've said, and I'm going to maintain, this team is not going to be the team we know or can really draw any kind of conclusion from, I say, until February. I know that's a long way off, and that's a lot of the season, 2/3 of the season, but there's so many circumstances this team is dealing with, so much that has to be learned by everybody, coaches and players, that I just think you're not going to be able to really understand what kind of team they are until you get into that point in the season. So once we get there, if we haven't seen progress, if we haven't seen, a team coming together, starting to get into situations against, like the game against Kentucky, showing that they can handle that, the coaches and players alike. And if we start to see that, that's good. If we haven't seen it by then at that point you can start to say, all right, let's move on. But we shall see as the season winds on and comes to a close. That's when it's really going to ramp up. And let's be honest, Louisville hasn't had an extensive coaching search for basketball in my lifetime. So it's going to be interesting to see how things progress in terms of that. The women last night, men got the victory over Pittsburgh. The women followed that up on Thursday night with a win over Duke, who was nationally ranked. So a good win for the ladies. They have gotten into a habit lately of pushing out to a lead, kind of like the men have done, and then right at the end of the game, letting the other team chip away and make it a little bit closer than it should be. Got up double digits on Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech whittled the lead down. Louisville held on for the win. Got up 26-1 on NC State. And NC State never really got close enough to threaten, but certainly enough to make it interesting. I think they cut the lead down to as little as 5 or 6 before Louisville held on for an 8-point win. And then against Duke, pushed out to an early double-digit lead and sort of maintained it. It kind of went between about 8 and 15, back and forth. Got up by 14 late in the game. They led 59-45, if I recall correctly, and then just kind of went into a rut, and Duke just chiseled away. And actually had a couple opportunities trailing just 63-60 to cut it to one or tie and just couldn't get it done. and Louisville was able to make the plays down. They shut them down. Duke shot the ball very well for much of the game. The difference was turnovers. I think the ladies had like almost a plus 20 advantage in turnovers, but Duke shot the ball very well. So they were either scoring or turning the ball over. But they were known as a very good shooting team, and they certainly did that. But in the last few minutes of the game, when it got very close, they were able to keep Duke from scoring at all. I think they shut them down for the last almost 3 minutes of the game. So that is good when you see that they were able to, against a very good shooting team, keep them from scoring at winning time. Very good sign for Louisville. And another good sign is Asia Dorr went down with a non-contact injury in the first half. It looked very scary, had to be carried off. And that's the last thing this team needs is your number one player and the potential, ACC player of the year have been playing so well. And playing well in this game, hit 4 for 4 from 3 in the first half. Had really kind of been the reason Louisville had the lead they did outside of the turnovers they were forcing. But she was able to recover, get some treatment, and come right back in. Looked a little bit hobbly, did not look 100%, but the fact that she was able to finish the game out, hopefully that's an encouraging sign. I think the word was that she tweaked her ankle and thought, I guess maybe sometimes, you roll your ankle and it feels like it's a lot worse than it actually is, but you never know. Over the next couple of days, they're probably going to have to look at it and see how it looks. But they were able to get the win 66-60, keep it perfect, 17-0. Not only is that now the best start, they set the best start at 16-0 with the win over NC State, but then this win matches the longest winning streak at any point for a women's team that I think, if I heard correctly, I don't quote me on this, I could be wrong, but I think the Final Four team in 2013 may have gone 17, had run off 17 consecutive wins, if I recall correctly. So great win for the ladies as they now look forward to another. They have 2 more home games after starting on the road, first 2 in conference. They'll get 3 in a row here at home. So just to wrap up, just to kind of look at the weekend ahead, the men, we're going to head down to Clemson Saturday at noon. Clemson nationally ranked. They're off to what is probably one of their best starts ever. I think they're now 13-1, 2-0 in the ACC. Louisville has never played in the Little John Arena. If you remember 2 years ago when they visited Clemson, they were renovating Little John. So they played in another location down there. It may have been in Greensboro, not even in Clemson. But they lost the game. One of those just head-scratching offensive, struggled on offense in that game. But Clemson wins over Ohio State, South Carolina, North Carolina State. They just beat Boston College the other night. Of course, Boston College, in the past you wouldn't think much of it, but they were able to knock off Duke, so they're a little bit better, I think, than they have been in the past. So going to be a good challenge for the men to hit the road. If they can get this win, obviously that's a huge start for them if they can get the road win, because they then visit Florida State on the road next week. And Florida State, I think, just beat North Carolina at home, will probably be ranked when Louisville goes down there. So it is not going to be easy, and I think we're going to start to get an idea. Now, again, I'm not going to put anything into this team until early February as far as my opinions of where they're going to end up, but you'd think that if they want to try and get off the bubble, they need to get one of these 2 road wins, and it starts Saturday at noon down at Clemson. The ladies are going to host Virginia Tech Sunday at 2 o'clock in the Yum Center, and then next week, the big game of the year at the Yum, Notre Dame, top 5 Notre Dame will visit for pretty much a battle to give one of those 2 teams the early leg up in the ACC for the regular season. So that's a game that fans are going to want to get out to. And then Sunday, Virginia Tech as well at 2 o'clock. So really cheap tickets to get to those women's games. So encourage you to get out there if you can and support them on Sunday. So to wrap up, a lot of people probably saw this. I tweeted it out last week. The president of the Tax Slayer Bowl, I don't even know his name, but that's not important, as you'll see, was introducing Lamar Jackson and Chucky Williams at the press conference. And this, I believe, was Friday morning of last week. The morning, actually, the UK-UVille basketball game. And he completely butchered the names because I guess they give him a sheet, and he just reads what's on the sheet. But Anyway, I'm going to play this for you. If you haven't seen it, it's hilarious. I'm going to play it a few times and then come back and talk about it. But this is the president of the Tax Slayer Bowl. He has just introduced Bobby Petrino, and then he is moving on to introduce Lamar Jackson and Chucky Williams.
And his two players, obviously, Martinez Rankin and Dez Harris. Nope, wrong sheet. Wrong. And his two players, obviously, Martinez Rankin and Dez Harris. Nope, wrong sheet. Wrong.
Nope, wrong sheet. Wrong sheet. So if you've had a bad day or you have done something you feel like you probably shouldn't have done, you can always look back at the Tax Slayer Bowl president. He has one job, to get the names right. And to his credit, after this happened, he looked and he said, well, I'm looking right at Lamar Jackson. You think I would get it right. So why did you just not say Lamar Jackson would be my question. But, nonetheless, you do give him credit for admitting and owning that mistake. But I have a feeling somebody has probably heard from the Tax Slayer Bowl president there for giving him the wrong sheet, although he should have known better than to not know that Lamar Jackson was sitting right next to him. In terms of presidents and things they do or say, the other interesting thing I wanted to talk about was last week down at the bowl game, a lot of talk started to circulate. There was a game watch party for the Louisville, Kentucky basketball game for the fans in attendance at the bowl game. And they had set this thing up. This was a university-sanctioned event. They organized it. They reserved a place, some brewing company down there in Jacksonville. Full Louisville fans. Everybody's there to watch the game, cheer on the Cards against their arch rival. And a picture of interim president Greg Postal started to circulate with him wearing a navy blue blazer and it looked white to me, but I guess it was a very light blue button-up shirt, and that's the outfit that he wore. Now, the fallout from this, obviously social media is hilarious and things like this just blow up, but there were two sides that kind of formed around this whole Greg Postal outfit. One side was, this guy's a UK plant. He's got on UK colors. This is ridiculous. He needs to go. And the other side was, you people are just tinfoil hat-wearing idiots for worrying about what the president of Louisville wears to a function. And really, to be honest, logic falls in the middle here, okay? If you're somebody who thinks Greg Postal is a UK plant because he's got a navy blazer on and a light blue shirt, then, that's a little off base. You can't really say that. I mean, if he was a UK plant and he wanted to wear UK colors, he would have wore UK colors, of which navy and light blue are not. Now, the people who have no problem with him showing up at a university-organized event at a road game or a road bowl game of significance for the football team and the university, watching one of the biggest regular season basketball games of the year, to not have anything at all U of L on his body or even U of L colors on his body, to me is a little unusual. If you're the president of a major university, it's pretty simple stuff to understand that you probably should show up at something like that wearing red, wearing a U of L button, wearing anything U of L. So to me, I don't think it's off base to criticize him for not wearing anything U of L or colors. So the logic here falls somewhere in the middle. Greg Postal needs to do better if he wants to be the president at U of L and support the programs across the board. You can't show up at a function like that in a navy blazer and a light blue T-shirt or a light blue button-up shirt. You just can't do it. Okay, put on a black coat and a red shirt, or a red coat and a white shirt, whatever. This is not rocket surgery, folks. It's just supporting your university, and that should be one of the primary functions that a president provides. So to me, I don't feel he's a UK plant. That's ridiculous. But I also feel like you can't just give him a free pass because he's a nerd or he's an academic guy. No, if you're the president, you should know, and you should show up in appropriate attire. And now, again, there's probably bigger fish to fry. I get that. But again, this is simple stuff. I mean, he's a smart guy. He should understand that. So he needs to do better in terms of the wardrobe choices. But I'm not gonna certainly say that he's a plant for Kentucky. That's going to wrap things up today. Appreciate if you tuned in. Tell your friends about it. If you retweet it, share it on social media, that will be great. Going to tune in each and every week and get this out there. A little late this week because of circumstances. I felt like if I got one out now, I could talk a little more about the women's game this week against Duke versus doing it and then having them play right after. So getting this out on Friday morning versus Wednesday or Thursday, but usually shoot for midweek. For Ville on the Ville, that's going to wrap things up for now. Thank you so much again for tuning in. And we'll see you next time here on Ville on the Ville. Go Cards.